The racist judge assumed she was simply another adolescent black girl with a bad attitude, till she disclosed that she was looking into him as a certified lawyer. The hum of shuffled papers, the occasional cough, and the monotonous chatter of attorneys discussing last-minute tactics created a unique cadence in the courtroom. However, something was different today. The atmosphere was so focused that it seemed as though the walls themselves were leaning in to watch what would happen. Judge Raymond Lancaster was seated on his bench, much above the rest of the chamber, in the middle of everything. He resembled an old, unyielding tree in his presence. His reputation was etched into the wood, as much as it was into the lives of those in front of him, after he had sat in this chair for 30 years. He was a routine dude. Predictable. Steadfast. He also had a particular taste in things, even though he would never acknowledge it. That's why he hardly looked up from the case file when Amira Daniels, 19, appeared in front of him wearing faded trousers and a basic top. One more. The court's time is being wasted by yet another young black woman. He was already aware of the outcome. It was something he had seen 100 times. As he adjusted his glasses, his fingers pounded languidly against the bench. He drooled, "Miss Daniels," dragging out her name as if it were a bother. "I see here that you were arrested for interfering with police business, resisting arrest, a direct violation of—" He hesitated and waved a dismissive gesture at the prosecutor, who hardly seemed eager to make the charges. "To be honest, it makes no difference. You were instructed to move, but you chose not to. That is an issue." The way he discarded her was laughed at by the audience, which was primarily made up of onlookers with nothing better to do. The arresting officers appeared smug as they stood rigidly next to the entrance with their arms crossed. Richard Calloway, the prosecutor, didn't even bother to glance up from his notes. Amira remained quiet, observing, listening, not impressed. Judge Lancaster waited with a cocked head. His lips curved into a mixture of amusement and impatience when she didn't answer right away. "Miss Daniels, do you think this is a joke?" At last she spoke something. "No, Your Honor." "Then I advise you to accept responsibility for your acts and treat this court with some decency. Perhaps you wouldn't be standing here now if you had focused more in class." Something in the room was offended by that line, that one patronizing comment. A small, quite undetectable shift occurred. A slow, dense silence fell. The laughter ceased. Prosecutors even looked up from their papers. However, Amira didn't flinch. She steadied herself with a calm inhalation before reaching into her purse. The bailiff stepped forward reflexively. As he prepared to reject whatever weak defense she might make, the judge rolled his eyes. However, the mood completely changed when she produced a sleek black leather case and opened it on the table. The courtroom went silent. There was a bar card inside the case, glistening, polished. It's obvious. A document carried only by licensed lawyers, a qualification that ought to have been unattainable for a 19-year-old. Amira tapped it delicately with one finger before setting it on the defensive table. "Your Honor," she stated in a calm, clear and unflinching voice. "I did pay attention in class. I passed the bar on my first try, graduated from law school at the age of 18, and am currently working covertly for a legal monitoring group." No one in the courtroom responded for 3 whole seconds. There was complete silence for 3 seconds before rumors started to circulate among the people. Judge Lancaster stopped grinning. The prosecutor straightened his posture and began furiously going through his files. The officers by the door looked at each other. The game was different now. Lancaster, however, wasn't prepared to lose. The length of the silence caused individuals to squirm in their seats, their discomfort taking up the words that should have been spoken. The air itself felt heavier. Judge Lancaster blinked as his mind processed what he had just witnessed. He parted his lips, then shut them again. He glanced at the bar card on the table, as though if he looked at it for too long, it would vanish. It didn't. The courtroom murmuring increased, whispers becoming full-fledged, quiet talks. "Who is she? Is this real?" Uneasy, the bailiffs moved. Calloway, the prosecutor, shuffled through his documents, as if his notes held the secret to what was going on. Amira remained still, not that she was gloating. She wasn't waiting for a round of applause or grinning. She simply observed the judge with patience, as if she were waiting for him to come to terms with a reality he had never thought was possible. Lancaster forced his voice back to the surface by clearing his throat. He scoffed, his voice hollow and forced. This is ridiculous. A prank. A falsehood. No way. He walked over to Calloway. Is there any record of this woman being a member of the bar? Calloway paused. I don't know, Your Honor. He typed frantically as his fingers fumbled across his keyboard. There was some color gone from his face. Lancaster's annoyance came out in sudden outbursts as he turned back to Amira. What the heck? Do you think this makes a difference? You continued to obstruct an arrest. Amira's head cocked. Was I? The query struck like a sledge. Slowly and deliberately, she reached into her purse once more, seemingly defying anyone who would try to stop her. She took out a tiny folder this time, and set it on the table. Your Honor, this is the body cam transcript from the officers who arrested me. She spoke steadily, assured. It indicates that I only inquired, what's the charge? That was all I was involved in. Not a threat. No impediment. I have a question. She slipped the folder in the direction of the bailiff, who paused before picking it up and giving it to Lancaster. The judge grabbed it and opened it. His jaw tensed as his eyes skimmed the opening few lines. Amira went on, her tone unflinching. The Supreme Court has decided that, absent actual interference with law enforcement operations, speech by itself does not amount to obstruction. It is not illegal to inquire. Lancaster's fingers tightened around the folder's edge. That's not for you to decide. He was uneasy about the ease with which she met his look. A decision has already been made. Hill v. Houston, 1987. The Supreme Court ruled that people can confront police officers verbally without worrying about being arrested. I can provide other instances where officers were determined to have wrongfully arrested citizens for no other reason than speaking if you'd like. The courtroom echoed with more muttering. As the young woman dismantled the judge in real time, everyone sat forward and watched. Lancaster's expression grew gloomy. He returned his attention to Calloway, who was still rapidly tapping on his screen. Well, Calloway's voice strained as he cleared his throat. Your Honor, she holds a law license. Her qualifications seem to be in order. The tension in the space exploded. A swell of murmurs. A journalist in the rear reached for their phone. A bailiff's lips faintly parted before he regained his composure. However, Lancaster refused to permit the transition to stabilize. His authority, his pride, was precariously poised. In addition, he was unwilling to permit a 19-year-old to complete the task. He abruptly stated, "This is entirely inappropriate. You enter my courtroom, disrupt my proceedings, and anticipate that I will dismiss your case on the basis of your assumption that you are more intelligent than I am." Amira did not move. No, Your Honor. I anticipate that you will dismiss my case, as it is mandatory under the law. The word struck like a blow to the ribcage. However, Amira was not yet completed. She approached the defense table, placing her hands on the polished wood. Everyone was compelled to lean in as her voice grew softer. And while we are here, she continued, we should also discuss another matter. She allowed the pause to linger just long enough to generate tension. Your Honor, I have been examining the transcripts of your previous rulings. A pattern of concern has been identified. The room was pierced by a frigid, icy silence. Amira retrieved a substantial stack of documents from her bag for the final time, and deposited it on the table. Would you be interested in discussing the statistical breakdown of your sentencing disparities? Judge Lancaster's entire demeanor underwent a complete transformation. However, he was not the sole individual who was experiencing difficulties at this time. The weight of Amira's words settled over the entire courtroom, as if a tempest was approaching. The stack of documents remained unmoved on the table, but its mere presence was sufficient to cause Lancaster to sway in his seat. His eyes darted to the papers, then returned to Amira, as if he were contemplating whether acknowledging them would solidify their reality. He was unwilling to peruse them. He was already aware of the contents. The issue was that she also experienced it. Your Honor, Amira continued, her voice remaining composed and methodical. Your sentencing record has exhibited a consistent pattern over the past 10 years. Before proceeding, she permitted the words to remain suspended in the air. Black individuals are subjected to more severe penalties than their white counterparts when they are charged with comparable offenses. In certain instances, the recommended sentence is doubled. Throughout the room, a sense of unease became apparent. A journalist in the vicinity of the rear of the room was frantically scribbling notes. The prosecutor, Calloway, appeared to be contemplating his own disappearance into his chair. Lancaster's forbearance was fraying as he exhaled abruptly. "This is not pertinent to the hearing that is scheduled for today," he stated. "It is," Amira countered, "if you intend to rule against me. Because that would result in the inclusion of this case in your expanding collection of discriminatory rulings." The judge did not provide an immediate response for the first time since the proceedings commenced. Amira slid the hefty folder closer to her, flipping it open. As she reached forward, she retrieved the initial page and stated, "Let's commence with a case from 5 years ago. A white college student, arrested for resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. You denied the allegations, attributing them to youthful indiscretion. The courtroom was devoid of any noise." Amira proceeded to the subsequent page. "A senior in high school who is black. The same accusations, the same circumstances. Convicted of 60 days in county detention." The atmosphere was more constrictive. Lancaster grasped the armrests of his chair. Another leaf was turned by Amira. "Here is another example. The defendant is white. Possession of marijuana, first offense. Probation was ordered by you." She presented the subsequent document. "Defendant of African descent. The same fee. This is the initial offense. You granted him 3 years. Enough." Lancaster's voice cracked as he yelled, "This is not a trial brought against me." "No," Amira replied with ease. "However, it is possible that it should be." The courtroom's murmurs intensified. A subdued whistle was blown by an individual located in the vicinity of the rear. The bailiffs, who typically maintained a composed demeanor, appeared to be experiencing some degree of anxiety. Lancaster was compelled to listen as Amira leaned forward, her voice now lowered. "Your Honor, I am not the first individual to observe your pattern. For years, civil rights organizations have been compiling this information. And do you know what they discovered?" Lancaster did not respond. "They discovered that your courtroom has one of the highest racial sentencing disparities in the state. Additionally, that is not an opinion. That is a fact." The judge's hand was hovering over his gavel, but he refrained from striking it, as he was aware that she was correct. Amira's every word caused the room to feel as though it were tilting, and the balance of power was constantly altering. However, she was not yet completed. She extracted the final sheet of paper and held it aloft. "This is a formal complaint that was submitted to the Judicial Conduct Board last month." Before proceeding, she allowed the information to fully penetrate her mind. "Your rulings have been accused of bias by numerous attorneys. And imagine what? This case, my case, was identified as a component of their evaluation." Lancaster experienced his initial moment of uncertainty. He was aware of the implications of this formal investigation. Examination by the general public. Additionally, disbarment may be implemented in the event that an adequate number of cases are determined to be unlawful. The correspondents in the rear had ceased to take notes. Presently, they were observing. For the first time, witnessing a judge who had spent decades sitting comfortably in his authority squirm. The courtroom was no longer his. It belonged to her. Additionally, the entire nation was on the brink of discovering the truth. However, Amira was not yet finished. The tension in the room intensified, causing Judge Lancaster's knuckles to turn white as he tightened his grasp on his gavel. He could sense the gaze of others upon him, as if they were observing and anticipating his actions. He was unfamiliar with the sensation of anticipation that permeated the air on this side of the bench. The unease that was edging in was evident in the rasp in his voice, despite his efforts to clear his larynx. "This is a courtroom, not a media circus. Miss Daniels, you are not authorized to be in this location. I am the judge, and you are the defendant." Amira raised her eyebrow. "Are you?" The query struck like a slap. The room reverberated with gasps. The bailiff, who had been immobile, made a minor movement. Lancaster's gaze was intended to intimidate her, as his lips were drawn together in a thin line. However, Amira was not readily intimidated. "Your Honor," she said, as she spoke slowly and deliberately, The authority of a judge is derived from the law, not the bench on which they sit. Additionally, the law mandates that you maintain impartiality, she advanced, thereby reducing the separation between them. The Judicial Code of Conduct mandates that judges must conduct themselves in a manner that fosters public trust in the impartiality and integrity of the judiciary at all times. Before proceeding, she permitted the words to penetrate her consciousness. However, your history reveals a different narrative. Lancaster struck his gavel down. You are not in accordance with the rules. Amira maintained her composure. She insisted, her voice unyielding. You may strike that gavel as much as you desire. However, it will not alter the reality. She made a slight turn and gazed at the reporters in the rear. I am uncertain as to how the public will react, given that a judge who is currently in office has been knowingly imposing discriminatory sentences for an extended period of time. Lancaster's respiration was irregular. As his chest fluctuated, he appeared diminutive for the first time, ensnared in the very seat of power that had once rendered him invincible. The prosecutor, Calloway, moved uncomfortably in his chair, evidently mindful that he was on the wrong side of history. He briefly observed Lancaster before turning his attention to the documents that were disorganized on the table. Amira was not merely revealing a judge who was biased. She was compelling an entire system to assume responsibility for its actions, and she was not content with that. Your Honor, she continued, her voice razor-sharp, I respectfully request that my case be dismissed immediately on the basis of judicial misconduct. The room was rippling with another exclamation. Lancaster's mouth clenched. He was aware that his authority was eroding. You are unable to, he began. However, Amira was already gravitating to Calloway. She spoke with ease. Mr. Calloway, as the prosecutor, you have the authority to dismiss these charges immediately. Calloway's complexion was paler. He was forced into a dilemma. Clear evidence was presented. The censors were in operation. Additionally, the public's perspective was evolving in his presence. He would not only be perceived as complicit, but also as an active participant in a corrupt system if he were to pursue this. He hesitated briefly before taking a deep breath and gazing at the judge. Your Honor, the prosecution has withdrawn all charges. Reporters raced to capture the moment, and the courtroom erupted in gasps, murmurs, and the frantic clicking of keyboards. Lancaster experienced a period of freezing temperatures. His visage was devoid of any hue. Amira inclined her head slightly. It appears that the law has finally caught up with you. The judge's gavel hung in the air, his authority now reduced to mere formality. He was unable to take any action. He had been defeated. However, Amira had not yet been completed. Lancaster felt the weight of the situation as it settled into the room, exerting a force similar to that of a judge's gavel striking his career. He initially opened his mouth, but subsequently closed it. In an instant, his authority, which was once absolute, had dissipated. The charges had been withdrawn by his own prosecutor. His courtroom, his domain, was now a spectacle for the world to observe. The reporters in the rear were already typing rapidly, their fingertips flitting across the keyboards. Employees of the court exchanged glances. The judge's face was ablaze with crimson as he gripped the edges of his bench, his knuckles turning white, uncertain as to whether they were witnessing a legal proceeding or the public dismantling of a powerful man. He was not accustomed to experiencing defeat. However, this was not merely a loss, it was an exposure. Amira's voice remained steady as she turned toward the throng. For years, individuals such as Judge Lancaster have concealed themselves behind their robes, assuming that they were impervious. However, the system he supported is currently being compelled to account for its actions. A single clap was heard from a male in the gallery. Subsequently, other individuals soon joined in, causing the volume to rise throughout the room. Lancaster's eyes darted across the throng, panic flickering behind his facade of arrogance. Amira returned her gaze to the magistrate. Your Honor, she said, almost ridiculing the title, I would like to remind you of something before I depart this courtroom. A stride closer was taken by her. The judicial complaint against you has been augmented. The evidence I presented today, a dense stack of documents on the table, was the object of her gesture. It will be formally submitted as part of that investigation. Lancaster's mouth clenched. He was aware of the significance of that. Infractions of ethical standards, boards of review, formal proceedings. Debarment. Calloway, who was still seated at his table, was analyzing the consequences in real time, as he massaged his face with his hand. Lancaster was not his objective. That much was evident. Lancaster made one final attempt to regain control. He exerted himself to speak, despite the fact that his voice was trembling. Amira forbade him from concluding. Her voice was firm as she spoke over him. Your Honor, you dedicated decades to ensuring that black defendants received the most severe penalties. Futures were stolen by you. You caused the dissolution of families. You violated the lives of others by acting as a deity. Lancaster's sinuses elongated. And now, Amira said, her voice ebbing to a near murmur, you are the one on trial. The room erupted once more. The reaction was unable to be halted this time. Two uniformed officials from the State Commission on Judicial Conduct entered the courtroom as the doors swung open. A veil of whiteness enveloped Lancaster's visage. It was observed by all. He was aware of the significance of this. One of the officials emerged, his voice resonating above the din. Judge Lancaster, the ongoing investigations into multiple judicial complaints, you are hereby placed on immediate suspension pending further review. Chaos ensued in the courtroom. The reporters immediately rose to their feet, their cameras flashing. The audience erupted in a combination of gasps and applause. Lancaster remained as still as a statue, his visage drained of blood. Amira observed the entire event transpire, her expression completely unreadable. However, as she collected her purse and proceeded toward the exit, she permitted herself to smile only slightly. Justice had finally arrived. However, this was not the conclusion, rather it marked the commencement. The sound in the courtroom was akin to a crashing wave, with conversations erupting, reporters barking commands to their photographers, and legal clerks who had worked under Lancaster for years now whispering as if their entire reality had just been shattered. Judge Lancaster had not relocated. His gavel, which was once a symbol of absolute authority, dangled in his grasp in an ineffective manner. His gaze shifted to the court officers who were now situated on either side of his bench. Presence of the individual is necessary. Confirmation that his time had expired. Amira observed the scenario, with a composed demeanor. The conflict had not concluded, not by a long stretch. However, this was the first genuine repercussion for a man who had spent decades destroying lives in the name of justice. Lancaster eventually discovered his voice, although it was more trembling than it had been previously. This is an error, he murmured, but no one appeared to be paying attention. I have faithfully served this court for 3 decades. This is a witch quest. Someone in the audience let out a raspy chuckle. The voice of a woman cried out, truthfully, please inform my brother of this. He is currently serving a 10-year sentence for the same charge that you dismissed, for a Caucasian college student. The room was swept by a gentle murmur of consent. Empowered by Lancaster's demise, others began to speak out. The moment was evolving into something more substantial. Amira addressed Calloway. The prosecutor, who was still visibly shaken, gazed at her as if he had just witnessed the unthinkable. For years, he had maintained an alliance with Lancaster, but the ship was rapidly sinking, and he was aware of it. She advanced at a leisurely pace toward him. She stated, I would like to inquire about something now that I have prevailed in my case. Calloway forced himself to inhale forcefully. What? She observed him squirm as she slightly inclined her head. Under this judge, how many cases similar to mine have you prosecuted? The inquiry struck me like a blow to the stomach. Calloway was taken aback, and he blinks. He began, but he was unable to continue. His lips formed a narrow line. Amira continued, I will inform you of the quantity. Excessive. The silence was unbearable. She maintained his gaze, anticipating his response. Calloway exhaled abruptly after what seemed like an eternity. He hesitated once more, and then with a new gravitas in his voice, he finally declared, I will assist the investigation. The room was filled with a collective groan. Lancaster instantly raised his head. You must be joking, Calloway. He was not observed by the prosecutor. His gaze was fixed on Amira. He acknowledged, I was a component of this system. I will no longer defend it. Amira conducted research on him. She had previously encountered males who were at ease, complicit, and safeguarded. However, there was an element of authenticity to this moment. It is possible that he intended it. Maybe, for the first time in his career, He had observed the fractures in the foundation of the system he had upheld. Alternatively, could it be, he was certain that he did not wish to engage in a downward spiral with Lancaster. It was irrelevant, regardless. Amira responded with a straightforward, "Good. Thereafter, let us commence our work." She reversed her direction and returned to the magistrate. Lancaster's respiration was now shallow, and his expression was apprehensive. He continued to struggle to reclaim control, clinging to the last vestiges of power he believed he possessed. However, that authority was forfeited. One of the court officers approached. "Your Honor," he stated, "you will be required to accompany us." Judge Raymond Lancaster was compelled to leave his courtroom for the first time, and he was unable to object. Amira collected her documents and draped her purse over her shoulder as he was led out. Every movement was captured by the cameras that remained fixed on her. She had presented herself as an implicated party. She was departing triumphant. The entire world was observing. However, this was not solely about her plight. It was about a much more significant matter. The reverberations of the day's events extended far beyond the confines of the courtroom. News, sites and social media platforms were inundated with the headlines within minutes. Judge suspended following explosive courtroom confrontation. A shocking legal showdown. A 19-year-old lawyer exposes judicial bias. The prosecutor has reversed his stance on a long-standing judge and has committed to assisting in the investigation. Reporters were already assembled on the courthouse steps, their microphones and cameras poised like weapons, prepared to record every word. By the time Amira emerged into the brisk afternoon air, she was scarcely able to catch her breath before the questions rained down in rapid succession. "Miss Daniels, did you anticipate this result today? For what duration have you been conducting an inquiry into Judge Lancaster? How do you respond to individuals who assert that you initiated this situation?" The crowd was silenced by her mere presence. As she raised her hand, she stated unequivocally, "I did not establish anything. I exercised my right to challenge injustice, as permitted by the law." Her face was illuminated by the flashes of the photographers, yet she maintained her composure. She was not present for the sake of fame. She was not present to receive recognition. She was present because this was a matter that was greater than herself. She noticed a woman standing apart from the throng, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. From the corner of her eye, her countenance was marked by a mixture of cautious admiration and silent disbelief. Amira promptly identified her as Lena Warren, the sister of the high school senior, who had been sentenced to jail under Lancaster, while a white student had been released. Their gaze intersected. No words were required to be spoken. Lena nodded once, a modest yet significant acknowledgement. Amira reciprocated by nodding. This was not solely about a single case. This pertains to the hundreds of individuals who were railroaded by a system that was never intended to accommodate them, including Lena's sibling. And now, that system was collapsing under its own weight. The piercing beep of her phone in her pocket abruptly brought her back to reality. As it continued to vibrate relentlessly, she retreated from the cameras and retrieved them to observe the torrent of messages that were pouring in. Some were from acquaintances, a few were from attorneys, some were from individuals she had never met, who expressed their gratitude to her. However, one message was particularly noteworthy. "There is an unknown number. We should converse. I have something that you will be interested in seeing." She was taken aback. She gazed at the screen for a brief period before turning her attention back to the courthouse. This was not the conclusion, not even close. She turned on her heel and walked away, casting one final glimpse at the reporters. She knew that the next event would be even more significant.